Well, I don't know how much I lost, but I had to make a tool to get that damn thing on. And what I did was I ground up an old set of cheap water pumps because of the way it protrudes there. Because you have to make that tab go down. So with the way that goes in there, it actually made it natural where when I squeezed it, it actually pushed this side down and let it hook onto this other side here. Did. Alright, let's see if that'll settle right down in there. There you have it. That's called the tank fin issue. I don't know if you heard me before. Now, it's not a total clog, but it is compromised, obviously. And I've got it set up rich so it won't hurt itself. So I got this saw here, it's a 357 that I've been working on, and you know, it's been a little frustrating. I mean, it runs and all that, but it has this hesitation pretty much as soon as you hit the throttle. I've gone through the gambit of things, like trying to tune it out with a low speed and see, I think what's going to happen in this video and videos like this is I'm just going to share the experience real time and then edit the heck out of it so it doesn't take 3 days, you know. So if you see a similar situation and stumble through the things I have, and if I come up with a conclusion, that's always an if. It takes some arrogance to assume I will, you know what I'm saying? I can shortcut your analysis time by quite a bit by saying what I did and made no difference in that same situation. So I would find that useful. I don't know if you guys will. And while I'm dabbling here, kind of a review. I've gone through this with the 350s of the same era. A whole bunch of these had intake issues because they had a plastic clamp, you know, for the intake manifold that would kind of relax a little bit over time and let air get drawn in between the boot and the spigot on the cylinder. What I've done, every time I get into one of these, just before I even go anywhere, I just change that to the updated steel clamp. Just do it, you know what I'm saying? Do that in the 350s as well, that whole class of saw. Getting back to chainsaws, have been off doing other things, you know. We had a horse tragedy. I don't know if I'll show any pictures of that, but had to put down a horse, my wife's horse. A lot of hay. Did some fishing in between times, trying to, you know, put together some quality outdoor time, you know, in between major projects. it's hard for me to get into the chainsaws unless I have like blocks of time, and that's it. You know, if I've got a day or 2 days, that's really when I can get the chainsaws in. But to try to grab a half hour here and a half hour there, well, I end up doing things like this. Had taken this in as a project because the last place that worked on it had diagnosed it as needing a carburetor, and they told the owner of the saw they could not get carburetors, and I thought that was a little bit strange. And so, but you can. Let me just take it and put a carburetor on it. So that's how this all started. And I guess I'll fold in some of the pictures. So I put a carburetor on it, and it ran, you know. One of those throw a half hour into a project and, you know, get it done. But it just didn't run the way I wanted it to. Kind of had a bog off the bottom and just wasn't running. Plus, to jump ahead a little bit, the carburetor had to be tuned with the screws way out, and that just didn't feel right. And I had noticed that someone had already pulled off the limiters. So I started going in for another look. Noticed that the ignition system that was on this saw was one of those long wire ignition systems that you typically see on a, you know, 372X torque or a new generic ignition system, which kind of told me that somebody had spent some time on this saw before it got to me. And I'd got it from a dealer who took it on, but they themselves had not worked on it. So it had bounced from one shop to the dealer to me. That's the litany of the saw. And so I'm thinking, you know, carburetor, I can do that. Threw a carburetor on it, and it wasn't just right. So now we're back to that point. Should have done a vac test right then. But I tried to tune it, and you didn't tune. So I futzed around for a little bit. I put a different carburetor on it, did a bunch of stuff. Pulled the intake off because it began to smell like an air leak to me. Changed the ignition system, put a different intake on it, and there really wasn't a significant change. So now, you know, I've got some time into it, and it's frustrating me. I decided to do a vac test, and sure enough, what I found was, that's an airplane landing at our airport, by the way. So when I did the vac test, it was a leak. So I dunked it in diesel, like I normally do, to see if I could see where the bubbles are. Nothing came out of the bearings, but it was coming out from behind the cylinder somewhere. You know, I wear glasses, so I don't have the best vision in the world. And I was having a hard time seeing where the bubbles were coming from, so I just tore it apart. You know, looked at everything I could see, did a goo gasket on the bottom just to, because that usually, by the way, is the best seal, and put it back together. I still had an air leak. Now I'm frustrated. Pull it all apart, start looking at things. Realized there was some damage on the piston right there. I started looking closer. This is not the top end, by the way. I threw the top end away. And when I started looking closer, I realized what the problem was. And that was an attempt to block the auto decomp port. They had stuck a screw into the cylinder. Actually, I have to go get it. I'll go get the cylinder because you're not going to believe this. No, I'll just put some pictures in there. I'll fold in some pictures. And that screw was leaking, and that was the source of my problems. Now, had I done a vac test, not pressure for time, probably would have figured that out up front. Instead of now, I've got several hours into the saw, and I just,
you know, get kind of sick of seeing the damn thing on my bench. I've got a lot of others. So now we're jumped into the middle of the story. I got the right ignition system off a different saw. It's a donor saw. New carburetor, Walbro. A new partition. A new bracket. New boot. I call those worms, but they're impulse pipes. So that's all new. Because I think it was leaking a little bit there as well. See, these brackets right here, it's plastic, you know. Basically, you have a screw going into plastic. And on these Huskies, it's a coarse thread screw going into this plastic. And, I mean, the good news is it's probably easy for them to manufacture. The bad news is if you take that thing on and off a couple of times, you've really weakened that thread quite a bit. And you really can't get as much grip out of these screws. They can't pull the carburetor in and seal as much as they need to. So I guess shop note number one, these are like $8. Change them. So that's what I did. I got all new stuff here. And I bought seals. But when I did the vac test, I wasn't seeing any bubbles from anything that looked like a seal. So I just submerged it right in the diesel. And the other thing I do is when I have it apart is I look to see whether or not there's a chance that a chunk of gasket got blown out from the oil tank side, the bar oil on the bottom. That seems like it's fine. The bearings seem tight. So at this point in time, I don't feel the need to tear the cases apart, although I came into this morning with the intent to do so. But a more rational me says, you know something? Finding that leaky attempt to plug that auto decomp hole is probably the source of your issues. Oh, the clamps, they're a pain in the ass, all right? Because basically to make it work right is you sort of have to let this go a little high so that you can hook underneath it, come that way. Well, when it's sitting on that plastic clamp, that's hard to do. It's not as easy as you think. And you know, I asked Bob, I said, geez, is there a tool for these things to make it a little bit easier? Well, there isn't. I made myself a pair of pliers. Well, maybe I should qualify that. Is I ruined a pair of pliers to try to make it an easier operation for me. And maybe I'll show you that. I try to assemble this stuff here with the cylinder off, you know. Just gives me a little bit more access. And by the way, if I end up pulling this back apart, you know, let's say I feel like I have to get in there and change the seals and the bearings, I will not take this apart. I will leave this glued on and clamped on. And really, in my mind, the least amount of disturbance you can do to something that's supposed to seal is the best, you know, possible approach. So yeah, I chicken out. I put just a real thin film on the inside of the boot, and I'm sure there are people who say it's unnecessary, but these darn things were prone to leak. And one thing you also have to do if you play that game is let it tack up before you put it together, because when that clamp squeezes, it'll sometimes squeeze it right off that flange right there. Whereas if you let it get a little bit sticky and tacky, the clamp is not likely to try to squeeze it off. So that's just a tip. Obviously, you got to line up the impulse with the impulse. And somewhere I've got a new clamp. Here's a new clamp. The part number 537438801. And again, stuff like that I highly recommend. Highly recommend. Here's a picture right here if you want to just replace it. the clamp where you have the latch, you can't put it over here. You know, there's just no room in the case for it. Maybe up, but that makes it hard to get to. You really have to do it on this side here. And sometimes you have to remove that to be able to get a good, you know, access to this so you can actually, you know, make it latch. Which is a pain in the neck, by the way. See, right here I don't have a lot of room to work with. That's it. There it is. Now the other thing I do is I'll take a punch. I know this is, again, one of those things that probably doesn't have to happen, but I would just feel better if it was that way. See, that's on there pretty good. I'm pretty happy with the way that came. I'm going to tap that down. It's latched, you know, I can tell. But I want to tap that tab down just a little bit. Alright. So I think what I'm going to do to assemble the saw is, before I get crazy, is stick the handle on. And this is kind of a little different than the 372s. The handle on these things go on a lot easier than the handle on 372s and those saws. And they just basically go right on. You got these goofy little anti-vibration bumpers. You know, they kind of go in down here. But you don't have to twist and turn as much, I guess is the point. And the other thing is, not to forget, getting the wiring on there. Leave it right there. And at some point we're going to put this goofy thing on. Actually, let me go clean this. All those coarse threaded screws. Ah, the smell of gas. One of the things I had to do on this saw was change the gas tank vent. One of the things I ran into, it's like, you know, it's one of those saws that was just, you know, the cliche can of worms. It'd run for a couple of minutes, it would stop. And you pop the gas cap and you hear a little hiss, you know. Had all the cliche issues, you know. I just finally got to the point where just tore it right down. You know, that whole 300 class of Husqvarnas are, you know, really pretty easy to work on. I like them. This is no exception. You know, go back and tighten all these. Sorry guys, I've got to do the darn saw, but I really want to listen to the last race as well, so unfortunately you're going to have to go along that ride with me. I'm going to put a little bit of 1184 before I put the cylinder on. Well, here's the start. You know, Zach Osborne won the championship for the 250s last weekend. He has the most of anyone this year. She's gone down and made that best pick up caught up with someone who's calling the sets that he made a couple passes in pretty quickly. But they launched on that big run. The French run was clean and Italy. You know, I think it was
Justin Cooper. Okay, it's his way. He wanted to start so badly, he jumped early and crashed right into the starting gate. My lead is it should be. Is that Martin? From my experienced championship level rider out here. Georgia, what are you hearing? What happened to the six?
Adam Cirillo and Jeremy Martin were side by side as they were coming.
Extreme insider, extreme outsider, 12 and 13. Who would have thought that? But that's what happened. And then we get the tail of the laptops. Big corners so from the end of this lap, we're going to the second roller. You know what's watch Osborne and Cirillo. You know, if Cirillo goes to the inside on a turn, it seems like Osborne goes to the outside. Cirillo takes the inside. They're using a lot of different lines. That's how around actually 2/10 quicker advantage AC, but he's actually pulled Osborne slightly to the time that Osborne.
There it is. It's on. I just listen to a race better to listen to someone drone on about put this screw here and that screw there. Huh? I'll let that sit for a second before I go crazy with it.
So it's also just information when they get back to the pits. It's a team effort where they can go, hey, you know, you were losing this Cinderella in this section. Watching the footage, he's going, yeah, he's doing this is what we think. You know what I mean? So it helps the debrief afterwards to make it clear. And there's a lot to figure out. The beat has gone back and forth. A couple of times Osborne has closed up. A couple of times
So this is the kind of bearing I was tearing apart this last month. This was out of the haybine, and the inner race was so corroded onto the hexagon shaft, I literally had to grind it in half and pound it off. Well, this saw has a mix of these fine and coarse threads, so I'm going to mention that the muffler mounts in the front here and the bucking spike, they're the fine thread, not the coarse. You know, the cylinder is the fine thread, not the coarse. But all the anti-vibe stuff is all coarse. You know, anything that holds the handle on is coarse. I'm not a fan of that stuff. You know, I'm just not a fan of it. Boy, I hope this darn thing runs. I got so much time into this. This is that multi-function switch, and one of the things you gotta see is how the wiring works. This here stabs right into there, okay? And of course, you have the fitting on the top here. Goes in like that. You know, sometimes it's easier just putting that on right out here before you get it in there. I've seen, same with the 350s, that that'll wear out. Sometimes you got to epoxy it in there. The other little detail is, notice how oval that is? That's the 357, 59. The 350s are round, and you can actually use these on the 350s and get a little bit more flow. Really not a bad modification. I got a brand new carburetor. Just one of those things where I'm tired of fighting with it. I want to put on the best chance of success possible. So, brand new Walbro. Got these long, coarse carburetor screws, and basically they self-thread. It's a self-threading, self-tapping concept, and kind of thing that makes you want to have skills. Because I have yet to see that junk in one of those, except for their plastic saws, but never in their pros, Boy, I didn't just say that, but it's true,
And what has happened? A mistake in a pass now. Osborne has struck. 6-year-old's going to try to cut back. He is set back there for exactly 20 minutes. And now Osborne has taken the lead. And once he has the move late in the races, he's hard to stop. Let's see if it get by.
As I said, typically riders will not give up, but they'll sort of settle at the fact that he's outperforming. Let's just take a good second. And that's what's going pretty deep. Osborne back and keeps speed on the bed.
Part of this race right now, Osborne has made that pass. Will he begin?
Yeah, it's quite a bit different than where it was, in terms of how much tension is on that.
Yeah, he gets into the first turn.
I've got to believe that that's going to make a difference right there.
Front wheel light, full shoulder gear.
Just take a screwdriver and pop the anti-vibe over those brackets there. So now what I've got to do is get the throttle on. Yeah, it looks like Zach Osborne is just doing what a champion does. Yeah, don't forget to put that rubber right in there. It goes underneath that wire. I take that wire and pop it up and out, and then once I got the throttle rod on there, just kind of put it back underneath there, and that holds things in place, just like that. All right, moving right along. I'll put the ignition on it this time. This one, the right one. I had to change it because they had put a ignition, basically the generic long wire one. I think what happened was the place that had it before, our dealer here, just started trying to change parts to figure out how to solve the saw, and they changed the ignition, they changed a bunch of other things, and just couldn't seem to get it to run. And it's because that cylinder was basically leaking right through that hole. Yeah, so that's the right ignition. Alright, I got this saw together, and its complaint was starts, runs, won't idle. And what I found was rather amazing, and I'll put some pictures in there. But what I found was kind of interesting. So I went and ran it in the wood, a test bar and chain. Kind of curious to see if it starts, first of all, without the choke. High idle, put the choke in. Runs, restarts. I think I'm going to add a little fuel on top and bring the RPMs down. But other than that, I guess it's a running saw. Well, when it went into the first shop it went to, it said it starts, runs, and won't idle. So let's see if it passed the idle test. I think it runs. I think it's ready to go back.